Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Julia Basha. I am the creative director at Just Vision, and I am the director of the documentary film Boycott. I wanted to start by thanking our co-sponsors of this event, the Institute for Middle East Understanding and Jewish Currents. We are going to have an amazing group of panelists talking to you today, many of whom were kind enough to put up with me for 3 years, following them around as they fought to preserve the right to boycott in America. Our team at Just Vision has been on the road with the film Boycott for 15 months now. We've been showing the film at film festivals, at campuses and community groups. And we are marking this week a very special milestone where Boycott is now available worldwide for streaming. You can watch the film on Amazon. You can watch the film on Apple TV, Google Play, and Vimeo on demand. So if you haven't seen the film yet, I encourage you to take a look. We are going to be starting our event today by watching a trailer of the film so that folks who haven't watched the film can have a sense of the story. And some of you may have watched the film a long time ago. So it's also a refresher as we get settled and start talking about the issues at hand. A lot has moved on anti-boycott laws since the film was launched in November of 2021. And that is why we're here today, to give an update on all that is moving on multiple fronts, because we are not about to start making another film and do Boycott 2. So this is your update for all that you need to know that has moved at the federal level, at the state level, as it relates to other efforts to crush the ability of Americans to advocate and express solidarity with the Palestinian people. We are going to hear directly after the trailer from our moderator for this event. The moderator is attorney Rebecca Abu-Shadid. She's been working on issues related to Israel and Palestine for many years now, and we are delighted that she gets to be here with us today. Rebecca was a board member at Just Vision for many years and is currently a board member at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Rebecca will take charge of the event and bring our panelists as we tackle several issues that I think will be of interest to you. If you have questions, we welcome them. You'll be able to ask your questions through the Q&A box. The Q&A box can be found at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you already have questions, feel free to start putting them in, and Rebecca will be asking them to the relevant panelists. We also have closed captions available. So if you'd like to use them, please on the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom window as well. And without further ado, I will call for the Boycott trailer to be played.
There are a number of examples of how boycotts have been used effectively, where people withhold their money, withhold their labor, withhold their time until things change. And to have a proliferation of bills that are criminalizing or penalizing that is really, really troubling and problematic.
I was just opening my annual contract from the state of Arizona, and I was rather shocked to see this.
In order to get our money, we have to pledge not to boycott Israel.
Like, what does the state of Israel have to do with Texas and elementary school?
Basically, all it says is contractor warrants he does not and will not participate in a boycott of Israel as defined by, and it gives the law number.
When people actually understand what the state is doing here, they would be absolutely horrified and appalled that would be trading away Americans' First Amendment rights so easily.
God's chosen to bless us because we protect Israel. I'm going to continue to do on a state level all that I can to support that.
I have the right to boycott anyone I want to, and the state has no business getting involved in that.
Luckily, we live in a country that they get their day in court, and we'll see what the courts decide.
You may not care about Israel-Palestine, but you should care if it's being used as a hook to legislate against free speech. How many words would I have to change in this legislation to use it to quash free speech of anyone who, say, supports Black Lives Matter or is involved in protesting for environmental reasons? And it's like 10 words. It's a template.
I regret not knowing more about the issue when I voted.
I'm looking forward for my day in court. Whenever you see injustice, regardless of what faith or gender or what's going on, you speak up. You have to say something.
Thanks again for joining us. So as Julia mentioned, I'm going to start off by asking a few questions of our panelists and the protagonists of the film Boycott, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A with the audience. So please, as the conversation is happening, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A box. Let us know where you're listening from. It's great that in this age of Zoom, we have people from all over the world who are joining us. And if your question is directed to a specific panelist, let us know that as well. So I'm going to start off by asking a few questions to Brian House from the American Civil Liberties Union and Alan Leveritt, the publisher of the Arkansas Times. And you're joining us in what is a very timely period for your case, Alan. The film takes us through your journey through the court system in the US and ends with the possibility that the Supreme Court will hear your case. And just last week, we heard, unfortunately, that they've chosen not to. So tell us, kind of, as you've gone through this journey, how did it feel to you when you received that decision from the Supreme Court? And what does it mean both for you as a publisher and for you as an individual who has fought for your First Amendment rights and as the publisher of the Arkansas Times?
Yeah, well, that was a very difficult morning, and we were very disappointed. The good news on our situation is that as we've gone through this process for the last 3 years, we have not had a lot of that state advertising, and we've been able to adjust our business model so that we are not as dependent upon state advertising as we were 3 years ago. We now have 3,572 subscribers to our website that pay us $120 a year, which now pays for our entirely meets the budget for our newsroom. And we now have a philanthropic director, even though we're aspirationally a for-profit company. We are raising money within the progressive community here in Arkansas to support the Arkansas Times, and we've had some success with that.
Now, Brian, I think, as an attorney, that most Americans are not attorneys. And so kind of their interface with the Supreme Court is going to be minimal, and it's limited to headlines. And they're probably very confused about what it means that the Supreme Court is not going to hear Alan's case. Can you break that down for us? And, for citizens who are themselves maybe looking at a contract like the one that Alan and Mick and Bahia had in front of them, how does today's world differ now that we've had this announcement from the Supreme Court?
Sure thing, Rebecca. I think the most important thing to understand about when the Supreme Court declines to hear a case is it's not the Supreme Court weighing in on the merits of that case. The Supreme Court's decision not to take up an appeal is not precedential. It does not express any of the judge's opinions about the merits of the First Amendment claims. What it's really the court saying is, for whatever reason, we don't have space on our docket right now to consider this issue, and we want to let it percolate further in the lower courts. And there are lots of reasons why the Supreme Court might decline to hear a case wholly unrelated to the merits. For example, the Supreme Court primarily looks at cases where either a federal law has been struck down or where there's a disagreement among the courts of appeals. Here, because many of our initial cases in Kansas and in Arizona in Mick's case, and in Texas in Bahia's case, resulted in victories, resulted in court decisions blocking these anti-boycott laws on First Amendment grounds. The state narrowed those laws and kept them from going up to the Court of Appeals. So what we ended up having is we just have this one decision from the Eighth Circuit holding that there is no right to boycott. And we argued in our petition to the Supreme Court that that's blatantly inconsistent with the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling in NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware 40 years ago. But other courts of appeals have not yet had the chance to weigh in on this issue. So that might be one reason the Supreme Court declined to hear it. What that means, practically speaking, is that within the Eighth Circuit, the decision in Alan's case, unfortunately, is binding law. So the lower courts within the Eighth Circuit in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas, and Missouri are bound by that decision. But outside the Eighth Circuit and throughout the rest of the country, the Eighth Circuit's decision has no binding effect. The Supreme Court's decision in Claiborne Harbor, which I think the Eighth Circuit gravely misinterpreted, still controls. And it basically means we're just going to have to keep slugging this out in state legislatures and, of course, throughout the country. But eventually, I think at some point, the Supreme Court is going to have to hear this issue. And when it does, we're confident that it will reaffirm what it said in Claiborne Harbor and uphold Americans' right to boycott.
Thank you. Alan, to go back to you, one of the things that really struck me in the film is when you talk about the fact that the Arkansas Times doesn't write about foreign policy and isn't interested in kind of expanding its remit, but at the same time, as a journalist, this was important to you from a First Amendment perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has this become an issue locally in Little Rock, that this law and your fight against it?
It's been very slow because, people in Arkansas really weren't aware that this law had been passed, which sounds kind of odd, but it's true. We did a fundraiser for the Arkansas chapter of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, last week. And we had over 200 people buy a ticket to support the ACLU and to support the Arkansas Times. And it was just a great sort of a progressive community event for us here in Arkansas. Little Rock is a blue island within a red sea. So we do have a lot of support here in our community. We're not going to be signing any pledges, even though we've lost our Supreme Court case. We'll continue to assert our First Amendment rights, and we won't be signing pledges in return for money from the state of Arkansas, which is basically the position they put us in.
Alan, this feels to me, you mentioned kind of the red and blue politics of it, but this feels to me like something that really could kind of reach across the aisle. Is this a conversation you've been able to have with?
No, it is crazy, Bill, here right now, to be honest. We have in Syria yesterday, they tried to introduce a law to make it a felony to be a trans person. It has just gone so far down the rabbit hole. There's just no, it's really,
it's not a conversation that you're able to have at this point.
Yeah, no, it's just, it's hammers and hatchets, and there's no room for dialogue.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I'm from Ohio and I have some of the same experiences.
Yeah.
Ryan, so what are the legal options now for Americans who don't want to sign the pledge? And how is the ACLU planning to engage on the issue moving forward?
So I think, especially outside the Eighth Circuit, Americans who don't want to sign the pledge have a First Amendment right not to sign the pledge. And so I think if people are confronted with these Israel anti-boycott forms, or now that we've seen this legislation metastasize to prohibit boycotts of fossil fuel companies, firearms manufacturers, all sorts of different businesses that these state legislatures are seeking to insulate from dissent, anybody who's presented with one of these unconstitutional forms, I urge you to contact an attorney or contact your ACLU affiliate, because we would certainly be interested in continuing to litigate those cases.
Brian, when you described that we didn't actually have what's called kind of a circuit split because these other cases didn't make it up. Is that, did I understand that correctly? I'm not a litigator. I'm an attorney.
No, that's absolutely right. What essentially happened is the initial version of most of these laws applied to any government contractor, including solitary individuals. And so those were many of our initial cases we brought on behalf of people like Mick and people like Bahia, who don't have a company. They're just contracting with the local government to provide some services. They were being forced to sign these anti-boycott forms. And when the courts ruled in those cases, and they said, well, clearly this violates the First Amendment right to participate in a political boycott, what the states did is they said, okay, we'll narrow these laws substantially. So they only apply to companies with more than 10 employees and contracts worth more than $100,000. Now, I don't think that changes the merits of the First Amendment question at all.
Right.
But what it meant is that, fortunately for Mick and Bahia, they were no longer confronted with this horrible choice. They could continue earning their living without having to sacrifice their First Amendment rights. And so In American legal procedure, if the individual's claim is fully satisfied, if they can go ahead without having their rights being violated, that means the case becomes moot. The court says there's nothing left to resolve here because this person has gotten everything they're entitled to. And so that meant that the cases unfortunately mooted out before we were able to take them up on appeal.
So potentially you could still have people who are facing this and they would still have cases, even under these rewritten laws.
Absolutely. A small business like the Arkansas Times, for example, might have more than 10 employees, might have government contracts worth more than $100,000, but they have the same First Amendment right to participate in politically motivated consumer boycotts that anybody else does. And we would bring a lawsuit on their behalf.
So potentially if that happened in another district and you ended up having this like split district, the fact that the Supreme Court has denied cert, which means they won't hear the case now, does that mean that you can't go back to them if the facts change?
It absolutely does not. And in fact, I think once there is a circuit split, the odds that the Supreme Court will take up the case increase dramatically. Often the court waits until it's seen how different circuits have resolved the issues. And it's called percolation, right? They want to see how different judges think about this. And after a sufficient amount of time has passed, a sufficient number of people have weighed in, that's when the Supreme Court says, okay, the table's been laid for us, now we can come in and finally put this thing to rest. And so I think, the fact that the Supreme Court didn't weigh in here does not prevent circuit courts from disagreeing with what the Eighth Circuit did. The Supreme Court didn't express a view on the merits.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Dima Khalidi from Palestine Legal. And Dima, you've been tracking these anti-boycott laws amongst so many other efforts to silence Palestinian rights advocates for many years. And you have what I would say is the most comprehensive tracking system and a robust legal team that supports advocates across the country. Can you share more about the broader context that these bills are kind of being passed in? They're being introduced and passed in a much broader context of trying to silence Palestinian right advocates and what Palestine Legal is focused on, and if that changes at all with the Supreme Court announcement.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, what's really critical to understand about these laws is that they're really only one facet of a much larger effort by Israel and its allies in the US to really neutralize what's a growing movement that's calling for Palestinian freedom. This is a movement that's concentrated among youth on campuses who are educating and moving their peers. They're organizing across movements. And, BDS campaigns, boycott, divestment, sanctions campaigns are just one way that this movement is trying to get accountability for Israel's flagrant violations of international law. The movement has continued to grow as Israel's actions and, its racist underpinnings are really harder and harder to defend. But because of this, what we've seen is that Israel and its supporters have invested tens and tens of millions of dollars to pursue strategies that are weaponizing the law to undermine this movement. So in Palestine Legal's work, for example, we respond to requests for legal support, and we're seeing all kinds of tactics being used. There are lawsuits that target nonprofit advocacy groups for their work for Palestinian rights, target food co-ops and academic associations for endorsing boycotts of Israel, like the American Studies Association. And that case, breaking news, just got dismissed in the DC Circuit after almost a decade in court. So that's news today.
A little summary of that if they're not familiar with it.
And, we see complaints that are legal complaints, usually alleging that advocacy for Palestinian rights amounts to anti-Semitic discrimination. And these complaints are made to institutions, employers, federal agencies. And the aim is really to censor and punish people who speak out on Palestine, with universities really being the biggest target because of the campus activism there. There's also a huge apparatus that engages in surveillance by groups that are often anonymous, and they troll activists on social media, blacklist them, dox them. They unleash online mobs to cyberbully them, call their employers, their schools, even law enforcement to investigate them. And in addition to anti-boycott laws that we're talking about today, we're also seeing the proliferation of laws that are trying to codify a distorted, widely criticized attempt to define anti-Semitism in a way that justifies labeling basically anything that criticizes Israel as anti-Semitic. So it's not just in legislatures, but Israel groups are also pushing this definition at institutions like the American Bar Association and universities to try to get them to adopt it. And that means that these institutions end up engaging in anti-Palestinian discrimination, because what the definition does is to demand the conclusion that Palestinian opposition to Israel's actions, let alone opposition to its establishment on the ruins of Palestine, is in effect anti-Jewish. And so Palestinian voices, experiences, activities, etc., should be condemned, scrutinized, censored, punished. So this is the broader context. It's important to understand because it explains the intent behind these anti-boycott laws. They didn't pop up in a vacuum. Israeli officials and numerous Israel advocacy groups and Christian Zionist groups have pushed these laws as one part of this larger repression machine. And the consequences are severe, not just for our right to boycott, but for our First Amendment rights to dissent in general. And what we've called a Palestine exception to free speech, it still exists, but in the same way that these anti-boycott laws have become a template to attack other boycotts. The repression of the Palestine movement as a whole, in all the ways I described, is also a template to attack other social justice movements. And just in terms of the SCOTUS announcement, it is significant because it means that we're likely to see more laws like this passed. There have been several new anti-boycott laws already introduced in state legislatures this year, along with a number attacking other boycotts, of course. But I want to also be clear that while these laws will continue to affect certain individuals and entities that contract with the state, and we've already heard from someone in, whose honorarium to talk at the University of Arkansas is in jeopardy because he supports boycotts and doesn't want to sign this pledge. But these laws do not and cannot stop anyone from engaging in boycotts, from continuing their activism. And that's really the important takeaway. Yes, we are going to continue to fight these laws in the courts, and we expect new decisions in the coming months and years to follow all of the other courts that have ruled that boycotts for Palestinian rights are protected First Amendment activity under what is still controlling Supreme Court precedent. But I think what's more important really is maintaining the momentum of the movement so that it can continue to shift the dominant discourse on Palestine and Israel. It can continue to change minds on campuses, in the streets, in the media, and eventually shift US policy away from bankrolling and enabling Israel's oppression of Palestinians. And the courts will eventually follow. I mean, it took the Supreme Court almost 20 years to respond to the Mississippi boycott during the civil rights movement, right? So we know that the movement goes on despite what the Supreme Court says or doesn't say. And in fact, the movement will influence the courts down the line.
And Dima, look, you're making an important point here, which is that all of this is happening in the United States, but there is an occupation that is happening in Palestine. And so how do you see these efforts in the US and these lawsuits and all of the efforts that Palestine Legal is working on? How do you see them as connected to what's going on the ground in Israel and Palestine?
Well, Rebecca, you know very well that we have the most overtly racist and fascist government yet in power in Israel. And over the last few weeks, we've seen settlers rampaging and burning down Palestinian villages, incited by Israeli officials themselves. We've seen the Israeli military invade Palestinian cities in the West Bank that have killed dozens and injured dozens of Palestinians. But let's be clear that this isn't an aberration. Every Israeli government has been racist and violent. Gaza has been under siege and bombed to the point of near unlivability over the past couple of decades. Palestinians under military occupation in the West Bank for the last 7.5 decades can't move or work or study or sleep without the constant reminder that they're under the gun. And of course, Palestinian citizens of Israel are severely discriminated against in their own land. So what I think is really critical to understand is that groups in the US that are behind this repression machine that I mentioned are fundamentally aligned with the policies and practices of this and previous Israeli governments. We also have to understand that the censorship, the silencing, the erasure, the criminalization that characterizes the repression machine here in the US is actually an extension of what Israel does to Palestinians on the ground. And it's exporting these methods, minus the militarized violence, although certainly we know about the deadly exchanges with US police forces. But the anti-boycott laws themselves are modeled off of an Israeli law that punishes BDS. And while it's not yet illegal to wave a Palestinian flag or to commemorate the Nakba here, as it is in Israel, that is the direction that Israel advocacy groups are taking things. Just as an example, we had a student client at George Washington University who put a Palestinian flag in his window, and the campus police came and told him to take it down, even though all kinds of flags were waving from dorm windows. And just last year, students at a New York school tried to put on a conference around Nakba Day, and the university canceled it. So, understanding that the broader repression of the Palestine movement in the US is actually key to Israel's ability to justify and continue its settler colonial project that attempts to replace Palestine with Israel, replace Palestinians with Jewish people from around the world. This is fundamental to understanding where these anti-boycott laws come from and what they're really trying to do ultimately.
Tima, thank you for that. And thank you for the important work that Palestine Legal is doing. I'm going to turn to Lara Friedman, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and one of the most brilliant people that I know. And Lara, you had a very memorable line in the film where you talk about and you warn audiences that these anti-boycott laws are a template to quash dissent on any issue. So can you give us an update on how these copycat bills that you warned us about have started to be introduced across the country?
Sure, and I want to give credit to Palestine Legal, which really taught me to pay attention to this in the first place. I started looking at these bills back in 2015, 2016, and started tracking them on my own. And that statement that I made in the film really came out of analysis in an article I wrote, I think in 2017. And I literally did that exercise. How many words, assuming that I am an actor on, wherever I am on the political spectrum, what would I have to do to repurpose these? And it's just a handful of words. And we first started seeing this happen in real life in 2021 and 2022. I think across those 2 years, we had a total of 6 or 7 bills passed in various states, and those were narrowly focused. They were focused on applying the same, it's the exact template. And you don't have to believe me, you can believe the legislators who say, I'm using the template of the anti-BDS bills because they say it on the record. And they were applying it really focused on the fossil fuel industry and the guns and ammunition industry to make sure that states did not contract with people that are boycotting or discriminating against these industries. So that was 21 and 2022. At the end of 2022, we started to see greater energy around this. And we saw that reflected in an action by ALEC, which is an organization that basically rallies conservative legislators from across the country and drafts model legislation. And they actually drafted and circulated a model bill at the end of 2022 called the it was framed as anti-ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance issues. It's the idea of taking these issues into account. And this legislation, I actually want to just read the summary. It basically is framed as the language of what you're not allowed to boycott says any company, you can't boycott based on them engaging in, quote, the exploration, production, utilization, transportation, distribution, sale, or manufacturing of fossil fuel-based energy, timber, mining, or agriculture. And then it's got brackets and it says, insert additional industries if needed. That's the draft bill. And so, looking into 2023, we have, I think, across maybe 15 states, we have legislation that's been introduced. Some of it's still focused on guns and ammunition, some on fossil fuel, but most of it is this broad, kitchen sink approach where you throw in, you can't discriminate against companies, you can't discriminate based on any of these issues that are of interest to the conservative legislature. And in a few cases, you have thrown in there abortion rights, trans rights. It's really a kitchen sink against anything that legislators want to call woke. And the last thing I'll say on this, I think that when I made that argument back in 2017, I think that this could be a template. I think people are like, well, you're exaggerating. I would encourage people to look at the case of Utah, where their legislation in 2023, which is trying to, again, expand the framework of BDS, anti-BDS legislation more broadly, they're actually simplifying it by just amending their past BDS law. They have anti-BDS legislation, amending it to add these other things to it. So it's not us saying, attributing intent. They're saying, yes, we've got this great format already in law with anti-BDS legislation. Let's just expand it to cover everything else we want to protect.
Laura, what's also interesting is when this starts to happen. So you mentioned the ESG law and, like the huge fund BlackRock is being targeted with this. And so it's starting to fan out just as you predicted, but people don't necessarily draw the line back to these anti-Israel BDS laws. It's as if, you see coverage and it's as if these laws just kind of came out of nowhere. Like, people are not drawing the line that's very obvious. Perhaps in Utah, but everywhere else, they're not really understanding that if you don't think that abridging your First Amendment right when it comes to boycotting Israel is a problem, well, here it is. It's, pick your issue that you care about. And it's very easy once a right is taken away to just keep continuing to expand that. So are you seeing, now that, as you mentioned, there's an expansion to organizations working on environmental justice, ESG, gun safety, are you seeing activism from those organizations and are you seeing them draw the lines?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, and to give some grace to people in the field who are activists, there is actually just such a, I think, we all know there is a surge of legislation targeting activism across basically the whole range of issues. So I forgive people for not necessarily making the connection. Where I think it's challenging, and I should say there's two different legislative surges that are both related to anti-BDS legislation. There's the legislation which looks like the laws that were used that are featured in the movie Boycott. And there's also legislation that is targeting investment of state funds and divestment of state funds. And both of those are being copied. There's also a surge of legislation across the country now, basically trying to ban pension funds and anyone managing state taxpayer funds from doing anything that touches on ESG, right? You cannot use any social governance, whatever, and any non-fiduciary concerns when investing state funds. I should point out there's an irony there because many of those same states have anti-BDS legislation, which literally mandates by law that you must consider a non-fiduciary issue when making state investments. So there actually may eventually be a contradiction that comes before the courts. The challenge, though, I think when we look at the pushback, and there's been a lot of pushback against the investment laws. You talked about BlackRock. And interestingly, a lot of that is coming from, I think, what people would think of as non-progressive sources like bankers associations who see this as anti-capitalist and are seeing their ability to do their business limited in ways that they see as unacceptable. But for the grassroots, I'm part of various listservs that talk about this. I think there's actually some resistance to connecting it to the Israel-Palestine issue and to Palestine rights as a struggle. Partly because people are really focused on what they focus on, and partly because there's a concern that if you connect it to this, it's going to be harder to win. The Palestine exception to free speech is so pervasive. And I think there's a concern that if in order to save free speech on fossil fuels, we actually also have to save free speech on Palestine, that is a difficult way to go. My argument to people is, you can pick and choose your battles, but if you're not actually going to take on the template, which is this law, you are going to be constantly fighting this battle because the template that you're leaving in place as you save your issue, is going to be used against you elsewhere. The problem is not what they're doing to you in this instant. The problem is that you have a template here that will allow people wherever they are on the political spectrum. In my original article, I raised the concerns that the right should have about this template being weaponized against them as well, right? If you're not going to actually address the underlying issue, which is an effort to erode the right to boycott writ large, which is very clear in the Arkansas case. You know, the court ruling is not about the right to boycott Israel. The court ruling that stands is about the right to boycott. And people need to understand that if you don't defend the right to boycott on Palestine, you're going to lose the right to boycott on everything.
Laura, thank you for that. We're going to take just a minute or two break, and then we'll be right back with some questions from Mick and Bahia. Welcome back. And we're going to turn now to Bahia Amawi and Mick Jordal, our two other protagonists of the film Boycott. And Bahia, I think everybody who watched the film, and for those of you who haven't seen it yet, you will fall in love with Bahia's children. You sued the state of Texas and won in 2019. And you also made clear, both you and your husband in the film, that it was an important message to send to your children and to the children in your community. Tell us a little bit about how that affected your local community and your children, and what's been happening in Texas since you won.
It was definitely an important decision for my kids to experience, because I wanted them to know that they are just as American as anybody else, and just because they're Palestinian doesn't mean they get denied their right for free speech, and that they should not be vilified because they're Palestinian. So it was very crucial for me. I do this with them next to me and them along with me in this experience. As far as my community, they were very supportive, and I think it showed them the importance of getting involved and speaking up. They were with me during the court case. There was a standing room only, and it was really very moving and touching to see all that support. And it really encouraged a lot of them to get involved in politics. And so we're having this actually coming up Tuesday, we're having Muslim Day at the Capitol, and we're having a lot of people from all over Texas coming to speak with representatives on multiple issues. As far as what's been happening in Texas, of course, after I won with the help of CARE, I was able to return back to my job with the same district, the same schools, with open arms, and without the anti-BDS law, which was extremely gratifying. However, of course, instead of the lawmakers getting rid of the law entirely, they followed and modeled other states who had lost at the individual level and amended the law. Even though the Texas federal judge recommended against it and advised against it, and he said it was unamendable. He referred to it as persuasion through coercion. So it's really appalling that, and it just demonstrates how they have no regard or respect for higher authority, which was very, disappointing in that case. But when they amended it, of course, they excluded now any individual contractors like me, and they applied only the law to companies with 10 employees or more, or $100,000 contract or more. Following that, luckily, we had another company based in Houston, A&R Engineering, owned by a Palestinian American who's been doing business for the city of Houston for a while. And he also sued with the help of CARE. And his deliberation was kind of strange, and maybe Brian can weigh in later on about it, but the judge issued an injunction only for his case, but the judge felt like it was not suitable or needed to issue a statewide injunction, which it's kind of baffling in a way. Now with the Texas legislature back in session, starting in January, we have a Houston representative who is introducing a bill to repeal the anti-BDS bill. He's not for BDS, he doesn't support it, but he sees the danger of this bill.
Yeah, but here, it's interesting because I think for most Americans, if you told them that they were not allowed to boycott the actions of the United States government, it would be completely obvious to them that that's unconstitutional. But it's the same constitutional right that's at threat here. And hopefully we will get a chance to talk to Brian about the case that you mentioned. Mick, you also won your lawsuit, as has every plaintiff other than Alan. And, you know, most Americans probably can think of reasons they'd like to sue the government, but haven't actually had the experience to do so. How was your experience suing the state of Arizona, and how has that changed you?
Yeah, it changed me a lot, I think. Everybody is different when they're told they can't do something. You know, think back to your childhood here. Maybe I was just an oppositional kid. I don't know, but a lot of people would say, okay, well, I'm not going to touch this issue, and they'll just sign whatever. Look at all the newspapers in my state and across the country who have signed these pledges. They're giving up their rights. For me, it made me react in an activist way. I was saying, heck no, I'm not going to do that. And I think for all of us who were plaintiffs, I mean, it was great to get to know each other. I didn't know of them before. I mean, we searched for other plaintiffs in Arizona, and we identified several, but they were afraid to become plaintiffs because they had employees and they didn't want to lose those employees. And so it's sort of a lonely road to, be a plaintiff on your own. And I'm very grateful to Just Vision for connecting us up, different plaintiffs. I've gotten to know Bahia well. I've gotten to know Alan well, probably had too many bourbons with him, but we've had a great time, sharing notes and whatnot. And in particular, knowing the Just Vision folks and other people too, like Dima and Laura, that made it a lot less lonely. And I have to tell you, as a lawyer, I've probably been, I've now, over 30 years, I've probably been in thousands of hearings. I mean, literally, some very small, others bigger. But when I went into court, federal court with Brian House, it was as if I'd never stepped into a courtroom before. Thank God he was there, and thank God for the ACLU. I think that people need to realize, for me at least, 80% of my income was on government contracts. And so that was being threatened. And what's not in the movie is that also at the same time, there was criminal legislation introduced in the US Congress. It's called the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. And it would have subjected people like me and Bahia and others all around the country to up to 20 years in prison for boycotting if we used a list prepared by the United Nations or any other governmental body. And that list targets companies that are supporting illegal settlements on the West Bank. It didn't even deal with Israel. It dealt with the West Bank. So how did this change me? It got me more activated. So I've been very involved in my own state here in Arizona with a couple of different groups pushing on different legislative actions, opposing certain bills, bringing speakers and whatnot. So it's made me much more activated. And I think a lot of people have probably reacted the same way. Okay, so I'll just leave it at there. So,
well, Mick, let me ask you, because you're in the purplest state of the protagonist that we've kind of talked to today. And have you been able to kind of have these conversations? Like Arizona kind of has a different politics than a place like Arizona or Texas. Have you been able to have conversations with maybe friends and neighbors that don't share your political views about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of people, and I feel like the more it's being talked about much more, and whether it's in between Republicans, Democrats, and whatnot, I do feel a sense of real shift, and in particular among Jewish friends as well, that there is real troubledness and a willingness to examine fundamental assumptions about the situation. So I do feel like there's a willingness to talk about it. There's still a big backlash too. And, we showed the film at the state legislature here in Arizona, Boycott. And one of our Democrats, who was very conservative and super pro-Israel, attempted to shut it down. So that was very, very disappointing. I have found too, I've been able to have 2 editorials in our main state newspaper. And I think several years ago, that probably would not have occurred. So I think that there is a slow shift in public opinion. And I think it's just growing now. And I think you're going to see that a lot more coming up.
Yeah, Mick, you're reminding me of 2 things that I think Palestinian advocates have said for a very long time. And, the first is that for people who are who count themselves as part of the progressive movement, you can't be progressive and then check those values when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. We have to be, consistent across the board when we're, putting our values in applying our values to our political views. And then the second is something that I've heard Lara say often, which is for people who say, well, this doesn't bother me and this isn't about me because I'm not into Israel-Palestine, is that even if you're not interested in Israel-Palestine, it's interested in you. And so as we see these bills expand, I do think it's an opportunity to kind of have conversations that might have been difficult to have with people otherwise, because everybody's in the end, people are often self-concerned. And when they understand that these overreaches could also affect them, I think it does open up some opportunities. Bahia, to go back to you, how did you process the news about the Supreme Court, even though it doesn't affect your situation in your case? How did you process that announcement?
I was really hoping the Supreme Court would hear Alan's case. I wanted this issue to be center of attention. I wanted Americans to learn, be more aware of this law that's going to impact basically everybody, because as Laura mentioned, it is a template and eventually it will be impacting each of us in one way or another. And I thought Alan was the perfect candidate to take on the Supreme Court because he's not an activist like Mick is, and he's not Palestinian like I am. He's more relatable to most Americans. He's a hardworking individual who is doing his job and he just wants to be left alone. And I appreciate that. And I think that's his right. So I was really disappointed that the Supreme Court didn't feel its importance, that this issue of First Amendment is crucial to tackle. So I was really baffled and why they wouldn't take it and extremely disappointed.
Yeah, Brian, no offense to you, but there might have been a movement to let Mick be the one that did the oral argument in front of the Supreme Court, to let Alan do it. Sorry. I'm going to turn to Sahad, the president and executive director of Just Vision, who produced and directed and imagined this film. And this film is a departure from what Just Vision has done in the past. Can you share with us what you've set out to do with Boycott and what you feel like is the success to date and what's next for the film?
Sure, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you again, Rebecca, for moderating. And just to say, there's more than 300 people from across the country and around the globe today with us, which is just incredible. And we couldn't be more grateful for your attention. As Rebecca shared, our team at Just Vision has been filling a media gap on Israel-Palestine now for almost 20 years. We've done that through documentary film, through journalism, and through strategic audience engagement campaigns. And up until this point, up until Boycott, our storytelling setting has always been on the ground in Israel-Palestine. We've been big believers that the grassroots matters. And when you flip the lens and tell stories from the grassroots up, you're able to see things differently. You're able to see the impact of policies on communities. You're able to see context that so often is missing from our mainstream media coverage. You're also able to see the very people who are courageously at the front lines and trying to change that reality. And because we've been interested in the grassroots, we've also been interested in the repression that they've faced by the Israeli government and other political leadership on the ground. And when we started to see legislation, the anti-boycott law, to target Israeli citizens from participating in boycotts of Israel for its human rights abuses towards Palestinians. When we started to see that take root also in places across the US and Europe, we knew that we needed to expand our lens. And so that's really what brought us to tell the story in Boycott. We were also, like Lara, very concerned by the exception and the template, the potential of the template of these laws. Specifically, for us, we don't believe that there are exceptions. We believe there are only templates, and Dima spoke to that very sharply earlier. And we knew that it would only be a matter of time before these templates would be weaponized against other communities. What we didn't expect, we definitely did not expect that these laws would start becoming used for other issue areas, targeting those who are concerned with abortion access and repro rights, transgender rights, workplace equity, environmental sustainability, gun safety. We didn't imagine that would happen so quickly. When we were wrapping the film in 2021, we started to see those new bills start to take form in places like Texas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, Alaska, punishing those who are boycotting fossil fuels and firearms. And more recently, a slate of bills that are moving across state legislatures, more than 30 since January 1 alone. Targeting a whole wide swath of issue areas. So with that, our goal and our purpose with Boycott is really to bring this story out to the public. We believe that part of the reason that these laws have been able to pass so swiftly has been in part because of the lack of public scrutiny. And so that really drove our decision to tell the story that we chronicle in Boycott. We also believe in a multiplier effect. We believe that when you have courageous people like Mick and Bahia and Alan and Brian, that their stories have the power to inspire others. And so that's what we've seen so far with our campaign around this film, and what we continue to be inspired and moved by.
Thank you for that, Suhad. Brian, so I'm opening it now up to Q&A. So please, everybody, put your questions in the chat box. Let us know where you're watching from. I'm going to start with a question for Brian. So Brian, people are interested on this idea that the laws have been rewritten to narrow who has standing in the court. What is the ACLU's plan kind of with those laws? And can you also touch on the injunction point that Bahia mentioned in Texas?
Sure thing. So, I mean, I think with regards to the narrower laws, we just need to find companies, government contractors that are now being subject to the new boycott requirements. And so actually the case that Bahia mentioned, A&R Engineering versus Paxton, which is being litigated by CARE, that's a perfect example. That case was brought after Texas narrowed its anti-BDS law, but CARE identified a plaintiff who had more than 10 employees, had a government contract with more than $100,000, and was being asked to certify that it's not boycotting Israel, and it is. So they brought this lawsuit. They did win a ruling in the district court holding that the law was unconstitutional. But as Bahia mentioned, the injunction in that case was limited to the individual plaintiff. This is something courts do sometimes, particularly for preliminary injunctions. A preliminary injunction is really a ruling at the outset of the case. When you have really important issues at stake, irreparable harm that can't be undone later, such as the loss of First Amendment freedoms, the courts will sometimes say, like, until the case is resolved, we're going to try to protect what we think are the rights at issue here. But they're an early part of the case. It's before the parties have had a chance to engage in discovery, before there have been actual factual findings. And so they're tentative rulings. And sometimes in those cases, the courts will say, well, I'm not too sure about my decision here, and so I'm just going to limit the scope of the relief to this plaintiff, protect this plaintiff's rights. And then after I've had the benefit of a full trial, we can figure out, what the ruling for the whole state should be. I think that was unnecessary in this case. I think the unconstitutionality of these laws is clear, but I think the district court's decision to limit relief to the individual plaintiff in that case doesn't reflect, decision one way or the other about the ultimate constitutionality of the law.
Thanks, Brian. And the next question is for Dima, and it touches on some of the points we've been discussing, which is this idea of a Palestine exception for progressive politics. Have you seen these laws as kind of a way that has that allowed Palestine Legal to kind of have conversations with other kind of progressive activist groups or other communities that you haven't been able to maybe break into before these laws started to be enacted?
Thanks for that question, Rebecca. Yeah, I mean, I think there is certainly the kind of situation that Lara spoke to, where the Palestine issue scares others away, and they'd prefer to deal with these issues without dealing with Palestine. But we've also seen a lot of folks who are coming to realize that the anti-boycott laws, targeting boycotts for Palestinian rights were really the template that, this is, that we have to consider the fact that, the same forces are behind all of these bills, really. If you look at the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Commission and different right-wing groups that are behind this legislative push, there are these laws have created a lot of opportunities to talk across issue areas, to really galvanize civil liberties communities. As we saw these bills pop up in different states, we have worked with coalitions that, bring together unions and, teachers associations and all kinds of groups that care about civil liberties issues and see the potential downstream effects, the slippery slope, the fact that these can and have become templates to attack other movements. So I think more and more we are talking to environmental justice groups and racial justice groups and others to really think through our collective strategy to confront these laws, not just in the courts. That is, of course, a critical arena, but also in the advocacy work that we do in the media. These are raising really critical discussions in so many arenas, and that has also been an opportunity to raise, the fact that, why we're boycotting for Palestinian rights in the first place. We have to center that in these conversations. Why, what is this really about in the end?
Yeah, you said what is to me a magic word, which is unions. Like, this is just so obviously something that is core to union expression throughout the whole history of the country. I'm going to go back to Mick, because you talked about organizing that you've done, and that this case and this whole kind of movement has really spurned more activism from you rather than shutting you down. It's made you more active. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like and kind of who your partners are in that activism?
Yeah, sure. I want to herald in particular a group that Just Vision introduced me to, and there's a great group, and it's with many folks in different states. There's some 19 states, and there's an effort, and I want to single out some names here because they're such great people. One is Sylvia Schwartz, Phil Benson, and Dave Mendel, and there are many others. And the effort is to approach our Democratic Party attorney generals and get them to weigh in with an amicus brief in the next case that's going up. They were all poised to be there in Alan's case and to submit amicus briefs, hopefully get our states on board. But now that case is not in place. So now we're looking at the Fifth Circuit case, the Texas case. There's going to be a pending ruling any day now. And it depends on, that could well go to the Supreme Court. But now it's time for our Democratic Party AGs to get on board and submit an amicus brief. No state has supported it yet. And now I think you're seeing these combination of issues coming together. And I think those AGs are starting to see that. And I'm meeting with our AG along with a former state senator. We're meeting on March 15th, and others are involved in that effort too. So I really hope that comes to fruition. My state before, under the Republican AG, drafted an amicus brief against Alan's position, and it was signed on by 16 states. They submitted that brief also in the Fifth Circuit. So it's time for Arizona to do some repair now that we have an Arizona Democratic Party AG, and I hope others of you will join that effort as well.
So, Mick, you're reminding me of what I thought was just a fascinating part of the film, which is this conversation that is captured kind of in the hallway in Arkansas, where is it Arkansas or okay, thank you. So Alan, my question is to you, which is, clearly in Arkansas, a lot of members of the state legislature didn't know what they were voting on, right? There's this amazing moment where we, the where Julia kind of captures someone in the hallway saying, well, I wish I knew more about it. I imagine that you have not been quiet in the past few years and have had a few conversations with your local and elected officials. If there are people who are listening, who maybe they're not going to be the next litigant, but they want to be somebody who has these conversations, can you kind of talk to them about how to go about it and give them some advice about what that experience was like for you?
Well, the thing, it's got a lot of people's attention right now is the template issue, because now we also have anti fossil fuels boycott, anti firearms boycott laws that have been introduced. South Carolina, and I'm sure it'll be in Arkansas soon. If your company provides travel subsidies for employees needing out-of-state abortions, you cannot do business with the state. And so, I mean, I think we're kind of old news in terms of the anti-BDS. That's been settled. But now we're seeing more and more of this, all of this coming out of ALEC, just like the anti-BDS came out of ALEC. And I think that's what's got people's attention now. We've prodded the state Chamber of Commerce, which we are not always on good terms with, but we've enjoyed kind of poking them, saying, when are y'all going to stand up for big business in Arkansas and stop this nonsense? But we haven't heard anything back from them yet.
So, okay, I'm going to ask a question to kind of whoever wants to jump in here, which is probably not a good moderator tactic, but I'm going to put myself in the shoes of somebody who is not necessarily an activist, but is listening, has joined us today, has seen the film, and is concerned. First question, how do I find out if there is an anti-boycott law in my state that's either been passed or that's currently being debated in my state legislature? How do I find that out? Dima, do I go to Palestine Legal? How do I find that out?
Well, you've definitely come to the right place, because a few of us are tracking these bills obsessively. And so, yes, you can go to legislation.palestinelegal.org. You can, Lara is tracking these bills, as is Just Vision. So I think all of our organizations can provide that information.
Okay, so we have 3 resources. We have Palestine Legal, Just Vision, and the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Now, I found out that my state has a law on the books, or they're about to debate this law, and I want to weigh in. How do I find out who the member of my state legislature is? And are there talking points I could use? Brian, does ACLU have anything like that? Like, how do I arm myself? Because I've never done this before, and I want to go in there and I want to, be convincing. So like Mick, Bahia, Alan, like, tell us, how did you go from
I think you get in front of
business to
you find out which legislative committee is going to be hearing the bill. And generally, we've done this in the past. Generally, then we can go in and testify before that legislative committee, and they're going to recommend a pass or do not pass on it. And you'll get sometimes lately they've been putting a 2-minute limit on any testimony because they really don't want to hear it. But that's the way I would go about it.
Bahia, have you had those conversations with your elected officials?
I was about to say actually that I learned this process going along with that, that lawsuit. I kind of had to be trained by CARE, because I, like most people, I wouldn't have known what to do, how to speak with them, how to register to be heard on the floor, all those things,
So feel intimidating.
It seemed like intimidating. It does, really, it does. And I have to say, it wasn't the best experience, I gotta say. Because first of all, the bill was supposed to be spoken to early in the morning, but somehow they moved it all the way to the last event, which was like 10 o'clock in the evening. So all of our supporters, most of them left. I don't know if it was intentional, they did it or not. I'm not gonna judge, but by that time it was 10 o'clock in the evening. So we're there from 8 o'clock when we're supposed to be having the bill will be heard on. And so most of the supporters had to type in. You can go in and actually type in your opinion on what you like to do. So there are multiple ways that you can speak, even if you're not there present in person, I stayed obviously all the way to the end, and I spoke with them. And by then, most of the representatives were so tired. Most of them left the room, even though they say we still can hear what's happening. It's being recorded. So it was kind of offensive in a way, but that was my first experience. It was a bad experience, but doesn't necessarily mean it'd be the same for everybody else, but it's definitely a very gratifying thing to be exercising your rights. It really felt nice to be able to go and do the American thing, exercise my rights as my, and express my opinion. So I appreciated that a lot.
Please.
And I should say the foundation doesn't lobby on anything. We don't take positions on the specific legislation. I would say that when people look at this, the point of entry generally for lobbying is find out who represents you. That's supposed to be your voice in the legislature and engaging them directly. Generally, a member of Congress at the state level or the federal level is going to be responsive to their constituents first and foremost. So that's a place to engage. I would say on these anti-BDS laws, setting aside the other boycott laws for a second, the record of members of legislatures being attentive to opposition has been mixed. And there are some states where there's been really good grassroots engagement opposing them. In those states, by and large, the legislation has been enacted by executive order anyway, because the political pressures underlying these laws are so powerful. They really are. But that doesn't mean it's not worth the fight, and it's not worth making that fight public, because this is part of a larger, these laws are part of what Dima has been saying. These laws are part of a larger effort to shut down space for talking about Palestine and Palestinian rights. So, I mean, I wouldn't allow yourself to be disheartened by the failure to stop these bills in each state. I think the fact of being engaged and talking to individual legislators and getting your voice out there publicly in and of itself has enormous value. This legal onslaught is not going to be ended via state-to-state engagement. The state-to-state engagement is important. It's going to be ended ultimately because there's going to be a powerful shift in the public narrative and in where the public is on this. And we see that in every issue. It's not unique to Israel-Palestine.
Go ahead, Dima.
I just definitely echoing what Laura is saying. And the other thing I would really encourage is for you to connect with other coalitions in other states that have fought these bills, that have, developed their own toolkits, that, we, Palestine Legal, ACLU, CARE, are able to provide legal analysis and lobby legislators, explain that these laws are unconstitutional. So, we and other groups are happy to connect you with coalitions that we've worked with and that have really built up around these anti-boycott laws. So there is a whole host of support that is available for folks trying to organize, and really it takes creating those coalitions where you are to really make that difference and to affect this kind of change and to enter the conversation and bring it to the public sphere.
I'm just going to jump in real quickly on talking points. So, the ACLU affiliates who try to oppose every one of these anti-BDS bills when they're introduced in state legislatures. So I would definitely suggest reaching out to your local affiliate, because we often publicly post our opposition letters. And just channeling those briefly, I think, broadly what you can say to your legislatures is, boycotts have been a fundamental part of American politics, from the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement to the boycott of apartheid South Africa. And in Claiborne Hardware, the Supreme Court unanimously recognized that boycotts are protected by the First Amendment. So what are you saying here? Could Alabama have outlawed the Montgomery bus boycott? Could our state have outlawed the boycott of apartheid South Africa? Why are you trying to trample on First Amendment freedoms? And I would pose that question to the legislators and see what they have to say.
Yeah, and one thing I will say is you heard it in the film that one of the legislators said, well, nobody called me before this vote, and I wish I had known more about it. And in my many years of working on Israel-Palestine, both in my home state of Ohio and in Washington, D.C., maybe it's an excuse, but often I hear, well, nobody's ever called me. Nobody has ever reached out to me with an opposing view. I only hear from one side of this issue. And so I think that it is really incumbent on all of us, even though it's sometimes a very steep hill and you often kind of lose the advocacy, like you lose that small war, but it's an ongoing battle. And I've seen a huge shift in just even the last decade. And I think that this is a true opportunity where people can see how the advocacy on this issue is affecting their everyday life and their everyday rights. And I say that obviously in my personal capacity and not in any way representing Just Vision, which also doesn't take any positions on legislation. But Suhad, let's hear from you.
So one thing that I just wanted to share as a reminder, Boycott is now available to stream worldwide online. It's available on Amazon, Google Play, Vimeo On Demand, and Apple TV. And the reason that is really meaningful to us is that it means that folks can access this around the globe and really equip yourselves with what we hope is a meaningful, compelling story to help reflect back to your legislators, to your community leaders, to your educators, to your faith leaders, what these laws are, what's at stake, and who are the people that are being impacted by them. So one, that film is available. We've been fortunate to be, with the wide support of many in our community, fueling a campaign around Boycott to make sure that this is in the public conversation, in our classrooms, in our congregations, in our community centers, and our conferences. We've been able to reach about 125 venues to date. We are going to keep going. So if you are interested in educating and equipping your communities with what is happening in your states, what these laws are all about, what the bigger picture is on Israel-Palestine that these laws feed into, and how it impacts social justice issues across the board, please be in touch with us. We're available at www.justvision.org. We will also make sure to follow up with everyone here, both to provide resources to the ACLU, to FMEP, to Palestine Legal, as well as staying in touch with us so you can continue to follow this journey. This is not a done deal. We are continuing to be on the road with the story because we know that it's going to be in our communities that this battle is fought. And we hope that the resources that we've created make it possible to have conversations in depth and continue to compel and move people to get involved, be inspired, and really step up in the many ways that so many, I just look at this screen and from the plaintiffs to the lawyers to the activists that are represented here, just incredible kind of models and role models that I'm inspired by every day. So with that, thank you. And please do be in touch with us if you'd like to get activated in your backyards.
So another tool that's available, justvision.org. There's an interesting question that I'm gonna pose to Julia. And we've talked a lot about how these anti-boycott laws are part of a much larger movement to kind of shrink the space for Palestine rights activists to move in. And that's not limited to the United States. We see that happening in Europe as well. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of similar legislation and similar efforts happening in different parts of Europe and the pushback we've seen locally there?
Absolutely. I will start by saying that there are many groups that are showing up regularly at the state legislatures and at the committee meetings, and they are very organized and they're very good at it. And so I think, over the course of production, I attended and watched dozens and dozens of hours of these meetings. And Christians United for Israel sends people there. The Israel Allies Foundation sends people there. And in 100% of the time, in the first round of these bills, there was no one arguing against these bills, only people arguing for them. We saw that changing after the lawsuits. And Mick, perhaps if we have time, can share a little bit of what they did in Arizona, because they actually organized. And when it was time to vote on the amended version of the bill, the the situation flipped, and there was an enormous number of people showing up to testify against the bills at these hearings. And it was very moving and very touching, and people speaking personally, and they were able to change the votes of a lot of the Democratic elected officials. This is taking place in other legislatures around the world. This is not just happening at the state level here in the US, and it's not just happening at the federal level in the US. In fact, we are waiting at any moment this week or next week for the UK anti-boycott legislation to drop. This has been something that people know is going to be introduced for a while now, but the British government has been a little bit in disarray, so there's been delays. And what that delay has allowed, though, is that many organizations have been coordinating with each other for a long time with the leadership of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And I really encourage, that is, talking about learning across movements and models. PSC, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, has built an enormous coalition with environmental groups, with groups advocating for various progressive issues, and have got these organizations officially on board on a right to boycott coalition that is using the film Boycott as a tool for galvanizing their constituents across the country. And I am going to be speaking at several events. We have already been in the UK with the film. We also have shown the film in Germany, which is a place where this is taking an extreme version. It's become practically impossible to be an artist or a writer, or to try to speak on behalf of Palestinians right now without getting yourself completely shut down and your events canceled. And we got to be part of an event called Hijacking Memory, which was really exploring that effort right now of the lobby in Germany to prevent anyone from speaking on behalf of Palestinians in Germany.
So you mentioned that Mick was actually able to organize himself into a win, which must have been an exciting moment. I mean, Mick, tell us about that, because I think sometimes people hesitate to organize because it just feels like an unwinnable fight, but that's not always the case.
Actually, I have to say it wasn't technically a win, but it was a big shift. What happened is the Arizona anti-boycott law flew under the radar, and it was adopted in 2016. I don't think anybody really knew what was going on or what it was, and it passed with overwhelming support. I'd say maybe 3/4 of the Democrats in the state assembly voted for it, and all Republicans. When they amended the bill in 2019, there were lots of us that organized, and we got people down to the legislature, and they testified, they contacted their people, and the vote was very different. We had a Republican majority in all branches of government in Arizona at that time, and but it passed with maybe only a handful of Democrats this time. So I consider that a victory. And each time we speak and present these issues, it's a victory that our voices are heard. Because before, no one heard, even the word Palestine put people into shockwaves, and they didn't even want to hear that word, and it was being shut down. So, it really changed the Democratic Party in my state. And we still have a lot of work to do, but that was a shift.
Thank you. I mean, we call it the democratic process for a reason. It's a process. Sometimes it takes time. So thank you for that. But yeah, I want to go back to you because of the 3 protagonists in the film who had cases. You are the only one that is a Palestinian American. And I mean, you were very important to our community as Arab Americans to see your case. But I imagine that you had a lot of conversations with family in Palestine about what you were doing and the impact of it. And maybe some of them were worried for you, or maybe some of them told you it wasn't worth it, or I'm sure they were all incredibly proud of you. But tell us a little bit about what that was like.
It's actually, I didn't expect that the news of the lawsuit would reach internationally, but I had phone calls and messages from not just family members from all over the world, from Germany. I have family in Germany and Austria. I have family in Jordan and Palestine and Qatar, but also I got from people I don't even know that, would message me of support and say, thank you for standing up for us. But my family, I didn't expect in my village of Bala that they would actually hear about the lawsuit. So, but they didn't understand what was happening. They didn't understand it was a lawsuit because this is something they're not allowed to do over there. So like, what, you can actually speak up and do something, so this is something new to them. And they were excited for me. And actually they gave me an award back in my town. I have not seen it because I've not been there, but I was humbled really by all the support, and they kept, keeping track of what's happening and making prayer for my safety.
Thank you for that. Suhad, I'm just going to ask you again, because we are almost out of time, if you can just remind everyone who's watching with us the different platforms where they can access the film and the resources that are available at Just Vision's website once they've seen the film, if they want to take action.
Absolutely. So the film is now available on Amazon, Google Play, Vimeo On Demand, and Apple TV. You can access the links directly from our website at www.justvision.org/boycott. We will also make sure to follow up with all of the attendees for today with those links and with several of the resources that the participants today have mentioned, including Palestine Legal, FMEP, the ACLU, and beyond. In terms of other resources, we have an in-depth legislative tracker that's tracking both the anti-BDS laws as well as the fossil fuels and firearms versions of the bills that have been replicated, so that you can see what's happening in your backyard if you're interested. And we'll be launching an in-depth discussion guide in the coming weeks so that you can be screening this film in your backyards as well. Please also reach out to us if you'd like to host a screening together with us so that we can join you for a Q&A and dig in deeper. I will also just say, as a reminder and echoing what has been said today, I've recently been reading Toni Morrison's essays on self-regard, and she speaks about truth being trouble. She was deeply concerned by the repression of artists and writers across the globe. And, the irony of her books being banned currently from classrooms across the country. What we're seeing today is and the attempt to really repress our voices is really an attempt to silence one of the greatest tools that we have in the fight for social change, in creating more fair, just communities. And so please do join us in screening Boycott and making sure that others are aware of these laws and of using your voice to bring attention to them.
Thank you, Suhad, and thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today. And thank you for all of you in the audience for joining us today. And hopefully you're leaving us invigorated and ready to watch the film and share it with your friends. And please do reach out to Just Vision and to the other people on the panel if you'd like to get more involved in their work. We again thank you to Palestine Legal, Foundation for Middle East Peace, the ACLU, and to Alan, Mick, and Bahia. Thank you.